It's again one of those moments in church life where I know what the party line is, what I'm supposed to tell you. But the party line makes no sense to me. And I'm again that feeling I'm either the only sober person in a room full of drunks or the only drunk person in a room full of sober people. I never know. I know I'm supposed to tell you to go use your God-given talents and multiply them and give them back to the Lord, because if you don't, you'll be cast into outer darkness, and that's not a happy place, because apparently there's gnashing of teeth. So here's my experience of parables. I feel about parables the same way I feel about puns. I have this friend from and there's never been a person with a more suited name. His name is Al Dry. He's still asleep. I'm going to still ask him permission to use his name. And with the confidence that he'll say yes, Al Dry has the driest sense of humor you've ever come across. And he writes these torturous essays on Facebook. And by Facebook standards, they are essays. Anything more than 4 lines is an essay on Facebook. And you just know that everything he writes is going to be a pun. So you scroll down with trepidation, waiting for that pun. You want to be ready. There isn't a single Facebook post where he's ever failed with a pun. Are so face-palmingly bad, I don't even want to share one with you. So in the same way that I step into Al Dry's Facebook posts with trepidation, waiting for that second meaning that the pun will offer, I have that same feeling with parables. I feel like I need to tiptoe in, knowing that although there's one meaning, there's got to be a double entendre somewhere. There's got to be another meaning. And I don't want that second meaning to trip me up. So when it comes to this parable, I think there's a few do's and don'ts we should think about. So let's start with some don'ts. The first don't is do not read this parable in isolation from the parable that went before it and the parable that went after it. Any clue about the parable that comes after it? It's that story about the sheep and the goats, do you know? When the Son of Man comes in all his glory, there'll be sheep on the left and goats on the right. Guys, you're not goats. You just happen to be on the right side of the church. So we have sheep and goats, and the sheep will be allowed into the fold, and the goats will be banned or something. Do you know the parable that happens just before this one? We had it last week. Oh, the bridesmaids. You go to the top of the class and you can have extra cake at morning tea. So the parable last week was about these 10 bridesmaids. They've all got some oil in their lamp and they fall asleep. And then the bridegroom comes and 5 of them have spare oil and 5 of them don't. And so this is the part where that doesn't make sense for me. Because then they're rudely told by the smug, I was going to say something else, bridesmaids that have the oil, go find a dealer and get some more. But it's like midnight. Now, even Coles in the 21st century closes at 9 o'clock. We're talking about the first century. What dealers open at midnight? That's the part. Anyway, we'll come to that later. So the first thing is, don't read it as an isolation. I'm suggesting that today's parable, which the lectionary only gives us, is one chapter of 3 chapters. It's the middle chapter of the 3 parables, so read it as one. And it's kind of like, you know, the story of the Christmas Carol. You know, imagine just reading the story with one stooge, you know, the ghost of Christmas past. You'd miss the whole plot of the story. The other don't is do not ignore the rest of the gospel narrative. So in other words, we have this from Matthew chapter 25, really helpful to read Matthew chapter 24, and really helpful to read Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 24, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple. Now, the kind of magnitude of that is missed on us. It's like, I was going to say, imagine someone predicting the downfall of the Anzac Memorial in Canberra. Imagine someone predicting the downfall of capitalist democracy. No one's going to be happy with you. In chapter 26, they start plotting the death of Jesus. Okay? So this is the most tense part of the movie, gospel. The tension is really, really high. It's palpable. So if the tension is high, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple, which is like predicting the downfall of democracy, the downfall of capitalism. And in chapter 26, they are plotting for his death. In chapter 26, he's held up for treason. What I'm trying to say is, in chapter 25, he's not going to go into some segue with a sort of moral story about being a good Boy Scout or a good Girl Guide and be prepared, you know. There's not going to be that kind of over-spiritualized pie-in-the-sky stuff in the midst of his treason trial, which is upcoming. The story is going to be political satire. It's going to have economic and societal impact. The final don't is do not read this as a story for you as an individual. It's one of the big downfalls of our 21st century Western civilization is we take everything too individualistically. So we think this is directed at us, one individual, in the 21st century, and it's about whether we go to heaven or go to hell. It's not about that at all. The final parable in this story makes it clear, because it talks about when the nations of the world are in front of the Son of Man. So at the very least, this story is about how communities, about how societies structure their lives together. So it has a communal thing. So it takes off the pressure about it being about us using our individual talents. Okay, so those are some don'ts. So what are some of the do's? Well, the most important thing is to take context into consideration. Not only the context of the narrative, the story, think about the context of the narrator, the storyteller. So what we know about Matthew's gospel is that it's after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in roughly about 70 AD, 10 years, that's not too bad. And it's addressed to a group of Jewish Christians and a minority group, and they're feeling outcast. So think about it. You're a Jewish Christian. The Gentile Christian, thanks to the good work of Paul, is growing in prominence. Now, the Jerusalem authorities are not that happy with you because you are a Jewish follower of Jesus, their sworn enemy. So you feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. When I was growing up, my whole family was Afrikaans, except my parents brought me up English. So in family gatherings, they would speak Afrikaans to everyone and speak English to me. Now, they probably meant well, but it really made me feel like the odd one out. So I was never Afrikaans enough in a family. But then when I went to school, all the kids used to sing Afrikaner vrot banana. Now, it means rotten. So at school, I was never English enough. So I kind of sympathize with that, and I feel like I'm whinging about nothing because I grew up at the end of apartheid South Africa. Now, that's sort of a minor whinge if you're a black person. The whole political and economic structure has excluded you from voting, from owning a business, from having an education. So it's like, there, little girl, get over yourself. But that starts to give us an experience of what this community is facing. They're facing apartheid. They are excluded. Not Jewish enough, not Christian enough. Yeah, that's going to be important. We also have to take into context the whole Gospel of Matthew. So here's how it works. In the parable of 10 bridesmaids, all 10 are naughty. All of them fall asleep, right? All of them run out of oil, right? 5 have spare, and the 5 that don't get locked out of the party. Now notice what the Bible doesn't say. In Matthew's Gospel, it doesn't say knock and the door will be open to you, unless you're a naughty bridesmaid without spare oil. Notice what the Bible doesn't say in Matthew chapter 6 or thereabouts. Give to anyone who asks you, except for the naughty bridesmaids who didn't think to bring extra oil. So perhaps this isn't a parable about remembering the extra oil. Maybe it's a parable about the feeling of being locked out. Maybe it's a parable of the feeling of you always on the outside knocking to get in. And the economic and political structures that keep you out of the party. So you are in outer darkness. But guess who else was in outer darkness? Oh yes, Jesus. In the final part of this parable, it is those who sit with those in outer darkness that are part of the kingdom of God. Those who clothed the naked, those who fed the hungry. One of the pivotal moments in Matthew's gospel is blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This sounds like outer darkness. So you're locked out of the party and you think, why am I locked out? And that's where the next parable comes in. It's a parable about how the economic systems of a particular time lock people out. So here we have a Lord who goes away for a long time. And he's so greedy that he wants the land to be bled dry in his absence and to still yield a profit. This Lord is not God. This Lord is a nobleman who profits from the poverty of others. There's a giveaway phrase. The third slave speaks truth to power, and he says, I know you are a harsh man. Is that God? Okay, the right answer is no. Just work with me. And you reap where you do not sow. Who reaps where they do not sow? This parable for me matches up a little bit with a similar parable in Luke chapter 19, where we think it's specifically speaking about Herod. And the parable tells a story about a nobleman who went away to gain royal power. Herod. Getting into bed with the enemy, namely the Roman officials. And when he came back, he called his retainers, his managers, forward. And those who bought into his system of corruption, this whole part about reaping where he doesn't sow, other parts of the Gospels talk about how they join land upon land. So they would tax. That's reaping where you do not sow. The first two slaves are welcomed into the system. The third slave speaks truth to power. I knew that you were a harsh man. I knew that you reap where you do not sow. And for that, he's cast into outer darkness, which I think is the space where Jesus operates. In summary, I'm suggesting that, very crudely put, this parable is not a story about heaven, about who goes to heaven and who doesn't. It's a story about earth and how we design our economic, social, and political systems in a way that is either consistent with the Jesus event or not. Once we've understood the parable in its own context, perhaps we can critique our own context in the light of this parable. So, for example, we can criticize the exploitive financial and banking systems who reap where they do not sow. If you are a senior citizen and you haven't been able to stay up to date with computer and other technology, and you are therefore forced to have a paper statement, do you know what happens? Okay, it's happened to you, I guess. It's like $3 or something to have a written statement. That's reaping where you do not sow. It's exploiting the vulnerable of society. I remember a few years ago where people were saying we can never take on the banks. And here we are, a gospel moment, a royal commission into banking practices. We can also criticize the exploitive financial services who take advantage of the poor especially. And that's something the Royal Commission into the banking industry brought to our attention. It's how insurance was deliberately sold to those who were ill-equipped and vulnerable in terms of understanding how it affects them. And finally, for us as Jesus followers, we can explore the ways in which we too can be cast into outer darkness, where we can sit with the poor in spirit, where we can sit alongside those who mourn, where we can sit alongside the blessed in our society. Baptism for us means being this third slave, means speaking truth to power. It means being cast out into outer darkness, where we love the marginalized, love the poor, support the rejected, help the hungry, and those who live outside the systems of power. Final comment is to note that we're on the final day of NAIDOC week, and as we explore their theme, we can think about the ways in which this parable points to how our systems that we've been complicit in, cast some into outer darkness.